Welcome to the last session of our third day of the conference on Kalecki and Kaleckian economics. So this is my pleasure to introduce to you Daniel von Allen, who is a master's student of economics at the University of Kiel in Germany. His research interests lie in the fields of monetary economics and forecasting. He gained practical experience in banking and asset management and currently holds a position in the asset management industry in Munich. He is affiliated with INET's Young Scholar Initiative and has contributed to the several projects in the past. So please welcome Daniel. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Gatsian. Yeah, I'm delighted to share that last session of this superb conference. Our last speaker will be Jerzy Osiatynski on the relevance of Kalecki and financial capitalism of the 2020s. So as usual, the session will last around 90 minutes. 45 minutes are reserved for the presentation, and 45 minutes for the Q&A session. I would kindly ask you muted throughout the session to not interrupt the speaker. And if you have any question, just feel free to raise your hand on the button. Then afterwards I can just call you on. Or simply type in your question to the chat, and I'm gonna read it out for you. All right, yeah, our speaker is a professor at the Biała School of Finances and Law. He was the chairman of the Scientific Council of the Institute of Economic Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences and member of the Committee on Economic Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He was a consultant of the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and other international institutions and NGOs in the area of economic transformation, notably in Central and Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Mr. Osiatynski is a member of the National Bank of Poland Economic Research Committee, and he was also Poland's Minister of Finance in 1992 to 1993. He's an author of academic textbooks and scientific dissertations in the field of economic theory, public finance, and history of economic thought of the 20th century. In 1993, he was elected the best Minister of Finance in Central and Eastern European countries. And also, Mr. Osiatynski served as a member of the Monetary Policy Council of the National Bank of Poland. So without further ado, Jerzy, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. When taking the floor at any conference at its very end, there is always some overlapping, and I do apologize for this, but as you will see, there will be some overlapping, especially with regard to the canonic Kalecki's profit equation, especially in relation to what was yesterday said both by Malcolm Sawyer and Erica Hein. So I do apologize for this. Now let me start with the short outline of the presentation. Can I take the next slide? Can you move to the next slide, Marcin? Yeah. This is the outline of the presentation. There are four critical differences between capitalism of Keynes, Kalecki's times, and the present-day financial capitalism of the 20s. The first one is wholesale globalization and liberalization of financial and capital markets, and the nature of political opposition against unemployment. The second are changes in income and wealth distribution. Now, while this issue has been widely discussed, I will concentrate only on the marginal, perhaps, issue of the impact of income transfers from rich to poor income households. It refers to Kalecki's third way to full employment. Then I will move to changes in businessmen pattern of behavior, whether to what extent they are simpletarian innovators or rent seekers. Then the question arises, what is the relation between Minskian financial instability or Kaleckian theory of business cycle? And then I will speak a bit on Kalecki's profit equation in a stock flow system model. And then there will be some conclusions. Now, the most obvious and important difference between capitalist systems studied by Kalecki and that of our time is globalization and wholesale liberalization of financial and capital markets. The government counter-cyclical intervention proposed by Keynes and Kalecki applied to a market economy with sovereign money without constitutional, international treaty or similar nature restrictions on the permissible upper limit rate of government deficit and public debt to GDP, and no similar restrictions on central bank financing government spending. For Kalecki, political opposition against permanent full employment was of domestic nature. It came, can you move to the next slide, Martin, please? For Kalecki, political opposition against permanent full employment was of domestic nature. It comes from business leaders. Martin, can you go to the next slide, please? Can you go to the next slide, please? Martin? Yes, thank you. For Kalecki, political opposition against permanent full employment was of domestic nature. It came from business leaders supported by small and large rentier interests that could be negatively affected should inflationary pressure appear in the boom phase of the cycle. Kalecki wrote, I quote, "In this situation, a powerful alliance is likely to be formed between big business and rentier interests, and they would probably find more than one economist to declare that the situation was manifestly unsound." This is what he wrote in the famous three-way of unemployment, 1943 paper. The policy instrument used by this alliance and the supporting them economists and politicians was the doctrine of sound finance, the aim of which was to make the government return to balanced budget policy, while the political function of that instrument was, and I again quote after Kalecki, to make the level of employment dependent on the state of confidence. End of the quote. With the end of the golden age of capitalism, the financial capitalism of our times restored the dominant position of the doctrine of sound finance and the state of confidence in economic and political argument, albeit in a modified form. The role of the bloc of rentier interests, of domestic big capital, and the supporting them academic economists and politicians has been much strengthened by globalization of financial markets and the speculative trading done in them. And the sound finance doctrine was augmented by the concept of the natural rate of unemployment. In the absence of sovereign money, while rigid constitutional and similar limits on debt finance public spending are enforced, and the cost of public debt servicing is decided by global financial markets, the room for counter-cyclical and full employment policies recommended by Kalecki and Keynes shrinks, except for military and similar spending. Only in three well-known cases those limitations do not hold: when the country is sovereign with respect to supply of its money by the central bank, this is the British case. Then, secondly, when the central banknotes of a given country and its government securities are dominated in those notes are the world reserve money, as in the case of US dollar. And when, thirdly, nearly all government debt is owned by the country residents, as in the case of Japan. Can we move to the next slide, please? The second difference relates to income redistribution policy instrument, which was Kalecki's third way to full employment. When in his theory of economic dynamics of 1954, he relaxed the assumption that workers spend what they earn and introduced workers' savings into his analytical model. This complicated his formal argument, but did not affect its conclusions. However, significant and lasting income transfer may with time ever less stimulate output and employment, giving rise to increasing propensity to save of low-income households, and thus to weakening the multiplier effect of a change in any autonomous component of aggregate demand. Then the stimulating or at least stabilizing impact of monetary transfer to low-income households would gradually disappear. However, this is not necessarily the case of transfers in kind to those households, neglecting their substitution effect, of course. And one might speculate that Kalecki would probably recommend a corresponding change in the structure of those transfers. Let me note in passing that increased household income, monetary transfers including, increase bankability and credibility of those households, thus enabling their deficit spending, a question to which I will return later on. The third difference, can I get the next slide, please, refers to the third difference, which I have already discussed elsewhere, relates to the pattern of behavior of businessmen. As it was mentioned yesterday and the day before, in the tradition of Kalecki, Steindl, and their followers, they were above all Schumpeterian, innovative entrepreneurs. They earned profit thanks to introducing new products and technology and opening new markets. This made them differ to capitalist rent seekers who earned profit mainly in financial transactions and the related wealth gains. Under financial capitalism, capitalist system, the Schumpeterian would-be innovators are dominated by financial rent seekers, and moreover, the former face the choice between expected profitability of investment, which incidentally, in Kalecki's investment decision function, in nearly all, I think in all versions of them, is also one of the determinants of those investment decisions, profitability, expected profitability of investment. So those would-be innovators face also the choice and are often inclined to invest rather into financial speculative investment rather than into developing of new productive capacity. When the power of rentiers increases and entrepreneurs are guided also by the wealth effects of their financial investment, those effects become an important core determinant of the course of the business cycle and economic dynamics. If, however, instability and cyclical development of the present-day financial capitalism are generated by factors that operate in financial and capital markets rather than, or as well as, by factors operating in the real sphere of the economy, to what extent instability and business fluctuations are of the Minskian rather than of the Kaleckian and Keynesian nature? Could we move to the next slide, please? The above-mentioned inherent instability of financial capitalism, which brought well-earned recognition to Minsky, is the essence of the fourth key difference between capitalist system of the Kalecki and the Keynes stance on the one hand, and the present-day global financial capitalism. What macroeconomic analytical framework do we need to study the economy in which speculation in financial and capital markets dominates investment in expanding productive capacity? To what extent business fluctuations and financial instability of the system are generated by factors defined by Minsky or by Kalecki? In Minsky's financial theory of investment, similarly as in the Keynes theory, the prime source of business crises are disruptions in financial markets due to alternating waves of optimism and pessimism, which in turn are transferred to the real sphere of the economy. In line with Minsky's financial Keynesianism, investments determine the volume of income needed to service the debt, and the volume of output and employment is, in a way, debt-driven, as noted by Toporowski. What is the difference between Minsky's theory of fluctuations in the financial market and Kalecki's theory of business fluctuations? For Kalecki, business cycle is an inherent feature of the process of investing in fixed capital assets, and it takes place in the real sphere of the economy. Its prime cause is the time lag between the income effect of investment, which operates in the course of investment construction, and its supply effect, which appears as soon as the investment project is put into operation and starts to impair profitability of capital stock of elder generations. Kalecki's theory of the business cycle is embedded precisely in this feedback between the income and the supply effect of investment. But his theory also requires that the period of fluctuations is roughly constant, and the oscillations are neither damped nor explosive. The former is secured by the time lag between an investment decision and the completion of an investment project, and the latter by random shocks of normal frequency. Notwithstanding his principle of increasing risk and the ownership of private capital determining bankability of an individual entrepreneur, and thus an important co-determinant of investment decision-making, for Kalecki, financing investment was not a prime cause of cyclical fluctuations, although it might inhibit private investment if increased demand for credit was not accompanied by sufficiently flexible policy of the central bank aimed at preventing a rise of long-term rate of interest. The world of Kalecki is neither that of Minsky nor of the present-day financial capitalism. When explaining instability and fluctuations in financial markets, Minsky did not expect a steady period of those fluctuations, nor their regular amplitude. However, if the course of the business cycle and of financial crisis is primarily decided by global financial markets and by the mechanism of business downturns discussed by Minsky rather than by Kalecki, then we have to face at least two challenges. The first relates to economic policy making, and the other to economic theory. Empirical studies of oscillations in financial markets provide no evidence of any regularities with respect to their period or amplitude. With the period of the cycle in the real sphere of economy in the years of Kalecki and Keynes, and until the mid-1970s, was on average 6-8 years long. The average period of the present-day fluctuations in financial markets is rather of quarterly dimension, and their amplitude is very volatile. Considering the time span between the appearance of the first symptoms of a financial crisis on the one hand and the first effects of any counter-cyclical policy, which may also have a quarterly dimension, does not the short period of financial market fluctuations undermine the potential of any counter-cyclical policy? And doesn't it undermine it, not because of the supposed changes in the shape of the Phillips curve, but because the period of financial market oscillation and the timeline between the start and the effect of even the most appropriate counter-cyclical policy measures are of the same dimension. The question related to the post-Kaleckian economic theory is this: how to modify Kalecki's canonic profit equation and the resulting equation of determinants of the business cycle cum trend under the present-day capitalism system in such a way that this equation would bring together factors determining the course of business fluctuations in the real sphere of the economy with those deciding about instability in financial markets and the feedback between the former and the latter. I do not have an answer to that question, not even intuition how Kalecki might have approached it. Towards the end of his life, Kalecki wrote he thought his investment decision function to be, I quote, the central piece of resistance of economics, end of quote, and that all his life long he tried to improve it. Needless to say, under the financial capitalism of the 2020s, this challenge becomes even more difficult. Finally, can you move to the next slide, please? Oh yes, well, I think I missed it. I've already dealt with it. Can you move to the next one, please? Yeah. Finally, let me draw your attention to a possible extension of Kalecki's canonic profit equation that may shed some new light on the determinants of economic growth. As I said before, Malcolm and Eckhart discussed yesterday the canonic profit equation of Kalecki, where profits are the sum of private investment plus budget deficit plus net exports minus household savings. Now, after some simple manipulations, we get an equation where on the left-hand side of which we have the difference between intended private savings and intended private investment, and on the right-hand side, budget deficit plus net exports. When intended private savings are greater than intended private investment, and assuming for a while equilibrium of the balance of trade, in line with that equation, the equilibrium of intended private savings and private investment must be matched by a positive deficit of the general government balance, i.e., budget deficit must be greater than zero. And as long as the economy operates in the situation of underutilized factors of production, that budget deficit will have to be of permanent nature. Otherwise, the ex-post equilibrium between actual savings and investment would not be reached through changes in the rate of interest, which would stimulate private savings and reduce private investment, and vice versa when the rate of interest falls, as stipulated by mainstream economics of Kalecki's and of our time. Instead, the equilibrium would be reached through the income channel, i.e., when intended private savings are greater than intended private investment, through reduction of output and employment, and thereby of profit and household income from which savings can be made. Kalecki's key concern was what happens when intended private investment necessary to achieve and maintain full employment is insufficient compared to intended private savings, which reduce aggregate efficient demand. From the point of view of government policymaker, Kalecki's concern may be phrased in the following question. Given the balance of foreign trade, what is the volume of net public borrowing, i.e., of the primary budget deficit, necessary to secure and maintain full employment? In line with Kalecki's argument, rising private savings, whether of workers, households, or out of profit, depress aggregate demand, private investment, and economic dynamics of the system. And to the contrary, when consumption is debt financed, it plays a similar function as that of debt financed government spending. That macroeconomic relationship has been long noticed and has been discussed by some speakers yesterday. However, debt financed consumption is not the only factor that can operate in this direction. In a stock flow consistent model, one should operate in terms of disposable aggregate income and that of individual sectors of the economy. This purpose is better served when we operate with gross national product rather than gross domestic product. Moreover, the rest of the world sector should be represented by all operations in current account of the balance of payments, and not only by net exports. Once this extension is followed, one has room to study not only the effects of household debt financed spending, but also of similar financing of the rest of the world sector. Can I have the final slide, please? While this may be a promising extension of Kalecki's profit equation for empirical studies, considering A, the limits to household debt financing and their spending, and secondly, the medium and long-run consequences of the present-day mercantilist policies and of foreign financing of domestic investment, I think we are back at Kalecki's profit equation and government debt financing is possibly the most important instrument of full employment policy. Then, however, I think we end with the question much discussed, especially by Malcolm Sawyer, but also by others, on how at least to trim the financial globalization of our times to make it serve full employment market economy that would be liberal and social democratic at the same time. With this question left open for all of us, I would like to finish my contribution to this conference. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jerzy, for your presentation. Is there anyone who has a question? Okay. Jan Toporowski, you can speak up if you'd like to.
But you have to unmute yourself first.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, no, you can speak on that.
Okay. Yes, I appreciate very much this your presentation. It's very much it touches upon many of the key issues that have been bothering me, in particular because I'm actually really come from a finance and banking background. I always liked Kalecki's approach to macroeconomics, but it seems to me that the and also the emphasis that exists in Kalecki on corporate finance. I think this is absolutely critical, and in connection, and the key connection being through Kalecki's principle of increasing risk, where the Kalecki puts forward the idea that it's really internal finance which is crucial for investment, for the investment decision, and that if you go beyond external finance, you have problems of, what Keynes called creditors and debtors risk, or what Kalecki called the problem of either watering down of profits. In other words, if you get more shareholders in, the same profits have to be distributed among a larger number of shareholders, or you have a problem of excess debt, and it's this that I think is makes for a very, very neat connection with Minsky, except really for one thing, and that is that in the when obviously at the time when Kalecki was writing, capital markets were clearly depressed by by the unfortunate events of 1929, and which had their echoes in Europe as well. And what emerged in the 70s, and really the period when Minsky was being most creative in his writing, was what Minsky called the money manager capitalism, but wasn't really it wasn't really money manager capitalism. It was really the rise of institutional investors who were taking savings or financial investments and investing them in longer and longer term securities. So you had the money market funds, which were buying securities. You had pension funds, the rise of funded pension schemes, all of which, in a sense, evaded Kalecki's principle of increasing risk, because if your shares are held by a pension fund, the pension fund doesn't interfere with the running of your company. because its portfolio is too large to bother with the management of an individual company. So you've in effect got what used to be called a sleeping partner, a partner who puts the money in but is not going to interfere with the running of the company. So and I think with this comes a number of, I think, raise questions over Kalecki's rather simple assumption that firms would not issue capital beyond what could be controlled by the internal controlling managers or controlling shareholders of the company. We have a more sophisticated system, and I think it's at this point that perhaps Kalecki's theory is vulnerable, or may need to be rethought, and that it's this point that Minsky addresses, and I would be interested in your views. Well, I think the conference may be interested in your views on this. We've discussed this before.
Well, thank you. I think there are two separate questions which you raised. One is the concept of increasing risk, and I think that referred to bank crediting of any entrepreneurial activity. So this was the key interest of Kalecki, both in the period of great crisis, 29, 33, 35, and then later on. And regarding government securities, this is slightly different question. I think leaving for a while aside the question of pension funds and similar institutions, investors into government securities, government paper, seek profit and seek wealth effects rather than financing of their future investment. And I think for Kalecki, the issue of finance related first and foremost to the expansion of productive capacities. Otherwise, what you say about those differences between Kalecki's years and Minsky's years, yes, it is true, but when you think about all that period when Kalecki wrote between the late 90s, 1920 90s, up to late 60s, there was a development also in the financial markets, but I have never spotted him sort of modifying the principle of increasing risk or trying to introduce some revisions that would allow for distinguishing between allocating liquidity or undistributed profits of firms of non-financial corporate sector between securities and investing in capital assets. I think this is a new phenomenon where, in fact, financial markets, in a sense, decide about economic development and economic fluctuations. That makes them not only prone to strong stagnatory pressure, but also to those short-run fluctuations which are characteristic of financial markets and different to what was the main subject of even prior to Kalecki, of Tinbergen and others, of the Shibok cycles of Tinbergen and then of Kalecki's business cycle. Thank you.
Okay, it appears that nobody else is raising his hand. Is there? Okay. Didn't see. Okay, Mario, you can go on.
Yes, just to follow up on that, on the whole question of increasing risk. In Kalecki, the way I always understood it was the idea that there's a net preference for internal financing, and but the problem that that we see in our current economies is that yes, there's a lot of internal financing, but there's insufficient investment in a sense. They're not investing, and the net preference rather is to engage in the financial sphere of things in terms of the money manager capitalism, which is that they are holding savings and they're able to make better returns, or at least this is until the financial crisis for sure. You had this gambling going on because there wasn't sufficient investment relative to their savings. And the reason why that was the case is because as I was saying to Mark earlier there, was that we've had a system which has been basically household credit driven or credit led growth, which has made that possible. So you've generated huge savings in the of the business sector, high profits, and insufficient investment because, of course, it's a lot more profitable to engage in this kind of financial sphere. So you've had these big changes, which are very different than the world that Kalecki was talking about, and was looking at in the 1930s, I believe. That's probably more fundamental. But this whole issue of internal financing, yes, I mean, I've personally, actually, there are other people who had written on that. I've had a long personal experience, with people like Eichner, but again, that whole issue, I think, has more to do with, as I said, it's about a society that is no longer there. I would argue, much of that has changed fundamentally, and what drives the system is no longer investment, as much as it is, consumption or household consumption, which has meant, as I said, a complete reversal, if you wish, of the role of these, in these sectors of the economy.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Well, this was the problem that was Kalecki's concern: insufficient intended investment, private investment, compared to intended private savings, and therefore the necessity for permanent budget, debt financing of government spending, whether of infrastructure investment or other social projects, as was already discussed yesterday and today. And from some statistics that and research that is done by a colleague of mine, it appears that at least in Poland, over the past 10 or 12 years, except for the last period, and that last period includes also 2019, and this, well, there is no data for the present year yet, and the coronavirus effect. But for most of the period, the liquidity of the non-financial corporate sector was, in a sense, invested in what you call gambling, i.e. for buybacks, acquisition, payments or bonuses to managerial staff and the captains of industry and so on and so forth. But and for various types of financial speculative transactions. And you know, you use the term gambling. Well, it's like a casino, but when you go to a casino, you always need to take some money with to either to lose it or to gain and win even more money. But first, you must earn that money somewhere, and it's the real economy in which you can earn that money. And when the entrepreneurs, instead of being entrepreneurs, rather allocate their liquidity into those financial operations, you will to observe stagnatory tendencies. So I think the stagnatory trend that you may observe in many developed capitalist countries results mainly from the changes in income distribution and changes in the structure of allocation of distributed profits between expanding capital assets and productive potential on the one hand, and financing and gambling on the other hand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations and for the questions. I would then conclude this session. I would just see there's somebody raising his hand. Ilan, if you feel like a brief question, you can of course submit it.
Yeah, a small question, maybe more related with Mario's comments regarding today's world. And a paper by Henry Jonas Pontusson from University of Geneva, they found out that if the distance between low income group and middle class is smaller than the distance between middle class and rich, then middle class tend to ally with low income groups and support redistributive politics. Maybe, I don't know if it is hold for all countries, especially when I think of my former home country, Turkey. I'm skeptical about it, but for developed countries, maybe it can apply. But especially when I think of these overhead labor or managerial class, in my terms, white collars, those indeed, how to say, stand behind this pension fund capitalism through their excessive savings, which are channeled to financial markets. Then in such a world, redistributive politics is a bit difficult to be seductive for these middle class people. I don't know. That's why what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have no comment that I could offer, especially that I do not know the paper you referred to. But as a matter of fact, when we talk about the debt finance household spending, this refers in my country, but I think this is also in other countries, not only to the middle class and managers and salariat, but also to low income earners, who often, considering the increasing number of precariat in all countries that we discussed here, they often have to learn to make a living until the next payday. And in that situation, of course, you will see an obvious political link, because under the situation, there will be social disintegration and rising all forms of populism. Although I do not especially like that term, but nevertheless, those are phenomena which certainly undermine any democratic system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.